So welcome, and this is the third lesson in a mini-series which is introducing you to computing and specifically to programming in Python. Now in this lesson we're going to look at the government's test and tracker for coronavirus and try and replicate it in some way and see how all the skills, all the things that you've learned fit together. But before we do that, we're going to look at some really current tech terms, things like the term full stack, which you may or may not have heard of. We're also going to look at some news before we actually begin creating this coronavirus app, and a few other things before we get started. So behind me on the screen is what's old news now, and I'm just looking at it on my phone. And it's basically that the government, this is in the United Kingdom and across the world, has rolled out a coronavirus test and track and tracing app. Now the idea is that the app uses Bluetooth connections to work. And once it's installed, every time you come into contact with anyone else who has the virus, your phone would record this fact. Now, if you developed symptoms, any other people who've been close to you would be automatically alerted, and they'd be told to self-isolate. Now, this is just one small aspect, this is one app, which is part of a much bigger effort by governments worldwide to contain and obviously to test and track the virus. Now, some of you are probably thinking, the apps that you see on your phone or websites that you look at, they don't look anything like what you're doing in Python. So the coding that you're doing in Python is very text-based, and it looks a little boring, a little drab. You don't see these user interfaces. And that brings me to something quite interesting, this term called full stack. What does full stack mean? And I'll explain that. It's quite important. Now, behind me is the website Test and Track. Now, this is a site that we've developed, my husband and myself, over a period of 2 years. It's now being used by well over 1,000 schools. An interesting link between what we were just talking about, that recently in this Test and Track sort of era and the coronavirus, we've had a surge of people, the wrong sort of people, coming to the site thinking it's something other than what it is, which is computer science assessment tool for schools. So that's quite interesting. And at the end of this video, we'll give you some insight into how it was developed and designed. But first, let's look at this term called full stack. So if you look up any job site and you're specifically looking for programming jobs, you'll come across this word full stack developer. A developer is someone who develops programs or websites or applications or games. And full stack, so let's have a read of this. It says full stack, Python, HTML, JavaScript, and it goes on. So what is full stack? Now, something you need to understand is that any website or app has two ends to it. It has a front end, and that's the beautiful bit, the user interface, the UI that you see. So if you're looking at our website, Test and Track, the stuff that you're seeing is the front end. And the languages used in the front end are always HTML, which is not really a language, it's a markup language which you use to make websites, and JavaScript, which makes websites interactive. So that's really about the visuals and the front end. And if that's something you're interested in, that's something you need to look into. But every website also has a back end, and that's where the interesting stuff is happening. So for instance, if you were to log in to Test and Track, the stuff that is happening in the back end is often done in what's called a back end language. Now, there are lots of different types of back end languages. There's JavaScript can be used again. You have things like PHP, and in fact Test and Track was done using PHP in a framework. And one of the fastest growing, most popular back-end languages now is Python, and it's used in conjunction with things like Django and Flask. So just for your interest, I think that's a useful little fact to remember, that full stack, the term full stack, is referring to a developer who is able to code on both the front end using languages like HTML and JavaScript and the back end. Now, one last thing, just to inspire some of you who are in your teens or you're just starting out programming and think, oh, what could I do? Well, actually, The guy on the screen behind me, his name is Avi Schiffman. We can read what he says himself there. He says he's a junior at Mercer Island High School. I think he was 17 when he created this. So he basically made this little website called ncove2019.live, which received not thousands but millions and millions and millions of people visiting the site. And it was a site which basically tracked the confirmed cases of coronavirus on a daily basis using something called web scraping. Now you could check out his Twitter page where he's quite active, and he actually was offered millions of pounds to advertise on his site, and he's a 17-year-old kid. So this was quite a simple site to actually create using web scraping technology. So a bit of interesting trivia for you there. So let's get started with actually making our own coronavirus tracker app. It's not going to be anything like as sophisticated as the actual thing, but it is going to help you start to think about how to design a program, how it all fits together, and how you think logically and computationally to actually solve a problem. So if you look at this site, let's have a look at an example. So this is just demonstrating the code that I have so far. So imagine that you have different trackers who have to actually be authenticated before they enter the system to relay some information. So enter tracker code. If I put in that, it says, oh, that's not a valid code, so try again. I'm going to put in a valid code now, which happens to be 1234, and it says access granted. Do you have some information for us? So remember, this is just me making up a different scenario for the app, which you'll be adapting. So enter full name. Yes, I want to report someone called Joe Blogs. He is, let's make him really a bit older than that. Let's make him 76. He is, should we say, Brazilian. He lives at postcode, fake postcode. Let's put something in there. Has he been tested? He's not been tested, but he has self-reported. And it says, this is interesting, it says we have stored these details, and the current log, which was 90, is now up to 91. So we're going to look at how that works as well. It then goes on to say enter email. So yep, I could enter the email and it's going to send an automatic alert to Joe Blogs, and it thanks me for being a really good agent. So what we're now going to do is I'm going to build this from scratch with you. And ideally, you should be following along and thinking about how then you can construct this and actually improve it, and think about how you could improve the app to include some of the features that the government talked about in the newsreel behind me, such as if you come into contact with someone else, it would alert them, and how would that work? So to begin with, it's useful to plan out your program and think about how it's going to be at the end, so how all the different parts fit together, etc. So from what you saw, you might want to rewind and think about what the different components were, but there appear to be three different parts to it. There appears to be a tracker login. There's also some sort of tracker entering information aspect, and there's also an email sender, right? And these are three different functionalities, and therefore we could create three different functions which are all linked together, which you'll see in a minute for it. So let's begin by doing that. I'm going to say def tracker login. You can call it anything you like, I'll just call it that for now. I'm going to make another function called tracker info. I make another one called send email. Now the first function that I want to work with is going to be this one. So that's the one that I'm going to start by calling down here. Now this is going to come up with all kinds of errors. So what's useful is just to add a little pass comment, not comment, but pass statement in there, just because we're not working with these yet. Now, in the tracker login, the first thing that happened was that the tracker was asked to input a secret code. So let's call it code. Let's have a variable called code and say input, enter tracker code. And I'm going to introduce a new idea here. Now we're going to have a list. Now a list is, you can call it anything. You can call it my list, you can call it tracker code list. Let's call it tracker code list. It is a list of items which is entered into between square brackets like so. So I have square brackets and I can put in a whole bunch of items. So I could put in like 1, 2, 3, 4, the different codes that are valid. Let's put in 777, let's put in 007, why not? And I have a list of acceptable tracker codes. Now you can use a list in all kinds of ways, as you'll see. And what I'm now going to say is if the code that is entered by the user is in the list, so is in tracker code list, then you want to print access granted, because they're clearly trackers who are valid. Else we want to say print imposter or something like access denied, right? But I don't just want to print access granted, I would also like to jump to this function, which is where the tracker is going to be asked for more information, etc. So how do we do that? Down here, just under print access granted, I'm also going to call the function tracker info, and it's going to jump to this function here. So now I can start to fill this in. I can say, I can put in some stars or something. Remember, this is just the back end, this is not the pretty interface, but we can make it a little bit pretty. And we say something like, welcome tracker, have some intel for us, or whatever you want to say, okay? And then that whole function is going to be padded out. Let's see if this works, and you'll see in a minute that it won't. Now, immediately, I can see there's one particular error. I've got a comma. Great, so let's get rid of that little comma there. And again, it's telling me that on line 3, something is wrong. Let's try that again. Right, so it's working. Now, what should happen is if I put in 777, it should, because it's in the list, take me to this. It should say access granted and take me to this function. But it won't. Now, if you can tell me why, that means you really, really understood about data types from the last lesson. So let's have a look. 777, oh, it says access denied, but it shouldn't. So you might want to pause the screen and think about why this is, and I'll tell you what it is. Now, the input over here is taking text input. Text input is always put in strings, is a string, and it's always put in inverted commas or speech marks. And you can see that in the list, the numbers are actually integers, so they're not string inputs. So you can solve this problem in one of two ways. You could actually cast and change the input into an integer, like that. So now the input is an integer. You'll see that it does work. Enter the tracker code, access granted. Or, if I just got rid of that, I could also go through and make all of these items in the list a string by putting them in speech marks, and you'll see that that also works. So you need to think about your entries and your data types as usual. So 777, welcome, have some intel for us. So now we're ready to start padding out this tracker info function. So you're beginning to see how this whole thing works together, and all the different skills that you've used. So let's look at our functions so far and our code so far. I'm going to name this function 1. This is just to remind you what a comment is. Remember, hashtag. This is the second function where a tracker enters information about people he's tracked, right? About something. So over here, we're thinking about the input into the program. Remember, you're thinking of the inputs, and typically an input would be a variable. So what sort of information do we want? We're going to start with things like name. Let's make it, let's add some stars. Okay, so we're going to say print, sorry, name is going to be the first variable, and we say input enter full name of the person that you're reporting. Let's pretend that that's how it works. We'd also like the age. Age, that's not the best way to really do this, is date of birth, because age could be variable. We'll leave that for now, just for demonstration purposes. And we could say ethnicity, we could say have they been tested, so let's say tested. And you advise them to respond saying yes or no, and self-reported. Right, yes or no. So ignore this stuff, this is just coming up with information about the code that you're writing, so you just click off it like that. So far we've got these variables, and we're assuming, we're not actually doing the saving to file yet, we're assuming that once this information has been entered by the tracker, it would be saved. So we could say something like print, thank you for this, thank you, this information is now saved in our database or something, right? And remember, we also wanted to say that if they have self-reported, and in fact if they've not been tested yet, but they've self-reported, we want to send them an email. So we would do an if statement, we'd say if self-reported is equal to no, right? And remember, we're using a double equal sign because we're checking for something. We're checking, we're not assigning a value like we are here into a variable, we're checking for something or equivalence. So if self-reported is equal to no, then we would say print, please enter, well, let's just jump to the next function, which happens to be this one, send email. So then we want to jump to this send email function, else just say goodbye. Thanks, tracker 1234. Well, oops. Whatever the code was. So we could say, well, I'll just say goodbye tracker for now. Right. So what it's going to do is it's going to jump, if they've said no, it's going to jump to this function, which we can now start padding out as well. So let's check it so far. In fact, let me just write print. This is the send email function. Oops. Okay, and let's see. So you can see it says I've got some bugs, debugging again, so it tells me line 20, something is wrong, and actually I can see here that I'm missing a speech mark at the end. Whenever you put in text, it needs to have speech marks. So let's run it again and see if that's solved the problem. It appears to have. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, access denied. Any particular reason? That's because it's not in the list. So let's put in a code that is in the list, which is 777. Welcome. I'm reporting Joe Blogs, who is 45, has not been tested. They've self-reported, and it says thank you, this information has been saved to file. And I said yes there. So if I had said no, it would be jumping to this next function, which is called send email, which is what we're going to get into next. Now the send email function, which is down here, can be developed in any way that you want. You can simply do what I've done, which is just add an email variable and ask the tracker to enter the email of the suspected person. Or you can think about how you can adapt this and make additional functions to make it more like what the government system is like. But for now we're just going to leave that as it is, and I'm going to introduce you to 3 extremely important, absolutely foundational and crucial theory on programming. And the first is global variables and local variables, the second is incrementation, and the third is passing parameters. Now you're probably listening to these words thinking, oh my goodness, how boring and how scary sounding, but they're actually really simple. So I'll explain each of them in this context of the COVID checker and using contextual examples. So let's start with global variables. Now, imagine a situation where in this tracker app that you're making, you would like to keep a log of all the COVID cases that have been reported by a particular tracker or in the app. So we could declare, let's call it COVID log, a little variable called COVID log. And note that this variable, unlike all the other variables like password, accepted codes, name, age, is outside a function. It's outside. Now, when a variable is declared outside a function, not confined to a function, it's called a global variable. And then it can be accessed by any function. However, this particular variable, password for instance, which is declared inside the COVID checker function, can only be accessed or seen, as it were, by the COVID checker function. It can't be referred to in here. So you'll see how this works. Now, to declare a global variable, you write global COVID log, you can call it whatever you like, and you spell it right, COVID log, and then you assign the variable a starting value, such as 0 or 90 or whatever you want the starting log of cases to be. You then can refer to it at any point. Now, I'm going to refer to it here, so I write global COVID, which just means I'm telling this function that I'm going to be using or referring to a global variable, and then down here I can do something quite interesting. Now, at what point does the COVID log go up to 1 if it started at 0? Or if it started at 90, when does it go up to 91? Probably at this point here. Thank you, we've stored these details to file. So what I'm going to do is over here, I could go for COVID log is equal to 1. And that would increment, so remember the word we said, incrementation, that would increment the value 0 and make it 1. Now, obviously this is not the best way to do it because it's not going to be automated and we're going to be running this function again and again. So the best way to do this is to write COVID log, which is a variable, and give it a new number, which is just going to be +1. So every time that we store details to file or we have a new COVID case, this variable, which starts at 0 or whatever number you give it, will go up by 1. And the process of going up by 1 is called incrementation. If you go down by 1, which is a -1, it's called decrementation. Now, how can we prove that we know what's going on? You can see over here, it's going to give me a COVID log so far. So if you type in print COVID log so far, COVID log, it's going to give you this initial value. And over here, it's incrementing it. So if I prove that that's happening, I could write something like updated COVID log and put in the variable. So what should happen is if I put in my tracker code, it gives me the COVID log so far, which is 0, and if I enter, we'll give it an entry, you can see that the updated COVID log is now 1. So we've used global variables to implement some incrementation, and incrementation is something you'll use all the time in programming. Just think of a game in which you have your health, which either decrements or increments, or think of a quizzing system. We've used it in Test and Track, where your score goes up as you do the quiz. So an extremely important concept, and that is incrementation. Now, most programmers would agree that the use of global variables can be beneficial, but wherever possible, it is much better to use this other technique, which is called passing parameters. Now, parameter, just think of it as a variable for now, and let's have a look at a context, again using this app in which this would be done. So now we're not going to use global variables. I'm going to get rid of this. So we're not going to have variables which are outside of functions. Every single variable that we have is going to be inside a function. So let's get rid of any reference. Got COVID log there and COVID log. Okay, so let's have a look. Now, imagine if we wanted to get really personal with this tracker, make them feel appreciated for all the tracking that they're doing. So we wanted to get their name. Now I could make name a global variable, like I showed. We could make any variable global, but instead we're going to make it a local variable, which means it's confined to a function. So I'm going to say enter name. Now note that we have another variable which is called name already, and this is the name of the COVID patient, suspected COVID patient. So it's always a good idea to have completely unique variable names. Let's call that tracker name. So enter your name tracker. Okay. Now, what if I wanted to refer to the tracker personally? So when they enter this part, got some intel for us, I'd like to actually mention their name, and at the end I would like to say thank you very much and use their name. Well, I could try to do that here. So I could write print welcome, and I could write tracker name. Now what happens here is you can see it says undefined name, and the reason for that is this variable exists in this function, but it doesn't exist here. So it has no idea what's happening. So how do you pass this variable, this parameter, to this function, enter tracking info? Well, the way to do it is you can see that this is where we call this function, enter tracking info. So in here, I simply type in the variable that I would like to pass, and I do the same thing over here. So now I've passed this variable into this function, and you can see that it's now actually working as it should. So let me just check to see that it is working. If I say enter your name track and I put in my name, enter your tracking code, you can see it says welcome Ruth. Now something else is not working there. Line 17, it tells you that COVID log doesn't exist as a variable. That's because I've not created it. I'm going to make it into a local variable. But you can see that this has been successfully passed. So let's make everything else a local variable, and let's pass the parameters on to this function. So I have tracker name over here. I'm going to have COVID log, give it a starting value of say 90, and I'm going to pass that variable as well as tracker name just by having a comma next to it along here, and you can see that now that's going to work as well. So I could do anything. I could pass any number of variables. I could pass the password along, which is actually their tracker code. So I could do anything I like, and you can have some fun with that. And the advantage of passing parameters is that you have complete control over the variables that are being passed from function to function. You can track more easily, you can test the modules much more easily. So passing parameters is usually preferred to global variables. Now I could, at the bottom here, say send email, and right at the end I could write print thanks for your great work, and actually refer to them by name, tracker name. Now again, this is a completely different function called send email. So tracker name is not recognized. So how do we send tracker name from this function where it is to this function? In exactly the same way. You can just pass it. That's why it's called passing. So it's like pass the parcel, and you do that. And then again, you can see that that works. So enter your name, Ruth. Oops, let's get a code that's right. 777. I put in some rubbish for that. Have I been tested? No. Yes. And I email some email, and it says thanks for your great work, Ruth. So this final aspect was looking at how to use passing parameters as a means of passing along variables from one function to the other. make an app. We've just made this little app, which is trivial in some ways as compared to the thousands of lines of code that you write when you're actually developing a much bigger website or an app. And if you don't design it at the outset, it can cause all sorts of problems. So if we look back at our little program that we have so far, and it's meant to send an email, what if the developers or the government, whoever's asking you to make this app, comes up to you at this point and says, actually, no, this is not how it should work. It should be sending emails and it should be contacting people who you've been in contact with, and suddenly you have to redesign everything that you've done. The reason I mention this is just to really get you thinking and to help you remember that before you start coding, it is so important, it is so helpful to have a really good design in place. So a plan for the different functions, the different features that you have, to actually plot out how it's going to look, and that will help you in the long run. Of course, that's not always possible, and you can always adapt a program, but it is really good practice. Now, to end this program, we did talk about you could just pad out this send email functionality. Hopefully you can do that, and you might want to actually look back at the news or actually download the coronavirus app and think, how could I improve that? Could I actually replicate that? Or is there a better way that this whole thing could be implemented? So it's something to think about, and this particular lesson has helped you to really look at a number of different skills, including using multiple functions, using this thing called incrementation, which you should be able to spot in a test now. So that's incrementation. Passing parameters, global variables and local variables. So that should help, hopefully you understand how the whole thing fits together. I mentioned I'd give you an insight into Test and Track and some of the design flaws that we've had. So at the moment, we've been doing a lot of adaptive design. So based on user feedback, we might make a change. Now, one of the things that in the next few weeks you might recognize as you use Test and Track is, as a student, your quiz-taking menu looked something like this, with drop-down menus. Now, I quite like drop-down menus, but we had loads of complaints from teachers, from students saying, oh, could you improve that? Could you make it look more modern? So we did actually go back and we had to think about how would we improve this design, and we came up with this. So what you see on the screen is what's called the wireframe. Now, a wireframe is a planning tool. You can actually download many wireframing software from the internet. You can even use PowerPoint. So this has actually been done in PowerPoint to wireframe. And a wireframe is a type of design. As I said, it is really useful to always plan what you're doing before you actually implement it. It causes huge amounts of trouble if you just get right in there and you start coding before planning, seeing how it would integrate, checking to see that you're really happy with it, all the different people who are involved. And so this is our wireframe, and this is something that you'll see on Test and Track on your quiz-taking menu in the next few weeks. Now, as mentioned, if life was perfect and everything we did was perfect, we would have a perfect design to begin with, but often what you do is adaptive design, as I mentioned. So ineffectively, what has been 3 lessons, we've learned all kinds of things, and we've learned about how to put all of those skills together to produce this final little coronavirus tracker. So if you have a little recap, we've learned about variables, about functions, we've talked about data types and casting. We also talked about incrementation in this lesson, and global and local variables. Remember, we said that global variables they can be used, they are useful in certain situations, but it's always better to be passing parameters, which is something we looked at, where you pass a variable from one function to the other. We looked at incrementation, as mentioned, and we looked at the use of multiple functions. Of course, if statements were quite a big one, and that's something you need to practice because if statements are used in almost every program that you can ever think of. Now, just to end, I want to make the point that there are 3 programming constructs, and this question is often asked in most exams, and the 3 are sequence, selection, and iteration. We've done the first 2, so the first one is just referring to a sequence of instructions, one after the other. The second one, selection, is just if statements. So selection is about conditional logic, or controlling the flow of a program. And the third one, iteration, which is quite challenging, there's lots to take in, is about loops, and that's what we're going to come to in the next lesson. So I'd encourage you to do 2 things. Finish the coronavirus app, improve your AI chatbot, and then start looking into loops, which is the thing that we're going to be doing next.